A stranger's gamble. When a drifter meets the woman who changed everything. When Caleb Ryder limped into that valley with nothing but a dying horse and a dead past, he thought he was just looking for a night's rest. He didn't know the green-eyed woman who opened that barn door would become the reason he stopped running. This is the story of a broken cowboy, a Chinese immigrant who refused to be invisible, and the Colorado mountain that witnessed their impossible love. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The horse gave out at the worst possible time, not on flat ground where a man could walk away clean, but halfway up a switchback trail carved into the side of a mountain that looked like God had taken an axe to the world and forgotten to smooth the edges. Caleb Ryder felt the mare stumble beneath him, that sickeningly familiar hitch in her gait that meant tendon or stone bruise or worse, and he pulled her up before she could go down and take them both over the edge. "Easy," he said, though his voice came out flat. The mare's ears swiveled back, but she didn't settle. Her breathing was wrong, short and hard, and when Caleb swung down from the saddle, his boots hit dirt that was more loose shale than soil. He ran a hand down her near foreleg, and she flinched, pulled it back, wouldn't put weight on it. "Damn it." He said it quiet, the way a man does when anger won't fix anything. The sun was already sinking behind the peaks to the west, turning the sky the color of a week-old bruise, and the temperature was dropping fast. March in the Colorado high country didn't forgive mistakes. Caleb looked back down the trail, nothing but scrub pine and rock and emptiness. Then looked up. The path kept climbing, snaking between boulders the size of freight cars, and somewhere beyond the next ridge there had to be something, a ranch, a line shack, anything. He took the reins and started walking, leading the limping mare. His own legs weren't much better. 3 weeks of hard riding and harder sleeping had left him stiff in places he'd forgotten existed, and the cold wasn't helping. He pulled his coat tighter, a battered canvas duster that had seen better years, and kept moving. The valley opened up without warning. One moment he was threading between rocks with nothing but cliff on one side and drop on the other, and the next the trail crested a rise and the land spread out below him like something out of a picture book. Somebody forgot to finish. A narrow valley, maybe half a mile across, hemmed in by mountains on 3 sides. A creek ran down the middle, silver in the fading light, and along the near bank sat a cluster of buildings, barn, house, a couple of sheds, all of it looking small and exposed against the massive silence of the peaks. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb stood there for a moment, just breathing. The mare nudged his shoulder, impatient or hurting, he couldn't tell which. He started down. The barn was closer than the house, and by the time he reached it, full dark had settled in. Lamplight showed in the house windows, but the barn doors were shut. Caleb hesitated, then knocked. Wood on wood, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind coming down off the heights. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, and heard movement inside. Footsteps. The rasp of a bolt being drawn. Then the door swung open and Caleb found himself looking at a woman who didn't match anything he'd expected. She was young, mid-20s maybe, and Chinese, which by itself wasn't impossible but was damn unusual this far into the backcountry. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Green, not brown or dark or any of the things he'd have guessed, but green like creek water over moss, sharp and direct, in a face that gave away nothing. "Help you?" she said. Her voice was flat, not unfriendly, but not welcoming either. She held a lantern in one hand and stood in the doorway like she had no intention of moving unless he gave her a reason. Caleb pulled his hat off. Old habit. "Horse came up lame about a mile back, hoping I could water her, maybe look at that leg before I push on." The woman's gaze flicked past him to the mare, then back. "You're not pushing anywhere tonight." "I can..." "Temperature's already below freezing and dropping. You take that animal back up that trail in the dark, you'll both end up at the bottom of a ravine." She said it matter-of-fact, like she was describing the weather. "Bring her in." She stepped aside. Caleb led the mare through the doors into lamplight and the smell of hay and horses and leather. The barn was small but well kept, everything in its place, tools hung on hooks along the walls. 2 other horses stood in stalls at the far end, watching with mild curiosity. The woman set the lantern on a post and moved to the mare without asking permission. She ran her hands down the injured leg with the kind of confidence that comes from years of practice, her fingers probing, feeling for heat or swelling. The mare shifted but didn't pull away. "Stone bruise," the woman said after a moment. "Maybe worse. Won't know until morning." She straightened. "There's an empty stall next to the bay. Get her settled and come up to the house. My father will want to meet you. I don't want to impose." "You already are." She picked up the lantern. "But it's a cold night, and we're not in the habit of turning people away. Stall's there. Use it." She walked out without waiting for an answer, taking most of the light with her. Caleb stood there for a moment, then shook his head and led the mare to the empty stall. He stripped her tack, rubbed her down with a handful of straw, checked the leg again himself. The woman was right. Stone bruise at best, abscess at worst. Either way, they weren't going anywhere for a few days. He hung the saddle over the stall door and walked out into the night. The house sat 30 yards from the barn, a low structure built from logs and river stone that looked like it had grown out of the ground rather than been placed on it. Lamplight glowed behind oiled paper windows. Caleb crossed the yard, feeling the temperature bite at his face, and knocked. The door opened immediately. The man standing there was tall and lean, somewhere past 50, with a weathered face and gray shot through dark hair. He wore work clothes, canvas pants, a wool shirt, and his eyes were the same sharp assessment Caleb had seen in the woman's. "You the one with the lame horse?" he said. "Yes, sir." "Maylene says you can stay until the animals sound. I'm Elias Hart. This is my farm." He stepped back. "Come in." The inside of the house was warm and plain. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, throwing heat into the single main room. A table, chairs, shelves with books and dishes, a ladder leading up to a sleeping loft. The woman, Maylin, stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot that smelled like heaven and made Caleb's stomach clench with sudden hunger. "Sit," Elias said, pointing at the table. Caleb sat. Elias settled across from him, studying him the way a man studies livestock at market. Not hostile, just thorough. "Where you headed?" Elias asked. "North." "That's a direction, not a destination." "It's all I've got." Elias's mouth twitched, might have been a smile. "Running from something or to something?" "From. Most men are." Elias leaned back. "You have a name?" "Caleb Ryder." "You have work, Caleb Ryder?" "When I can find it." "You find much up here?" "Haven't been looking much up here." Maylene set a bowl in front of him, stew, thick with meat and potatoes and carrots, and a hunk of bread beside it. Caleb looked up at her, but she'd already turned away, setting another bowl in front of her father. "Eat," Elias said. Caleb ate. He tried to pace himself, but it had been 2 days since his last real meal, and the stew was good, better than good, and before he knew it, the bowl was empty, and Maylene was refilling it without being asked. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, still not meeting his eyes, and returned to the stove. "You run into trouble on the trail?" Elias asked. Caleb shook his head. "Horse trouble, that's all." "Long way to come for horse trouble." "Long way to go for anything else." Elias studied him for another moment, then seemed to decide something. "You can sleep in the barn tonight. Tomorrow we'll see about that horse. If she needs more than a day or two, you'll work for your keep." "I can do that." "Didn't ask if you could, said you will." Elias pushed back from the table. "Maylene will get you a blanket." He climbed the ladder to the loft without another word. Caleb sat there, holding the empty bowl, feeling the warmth of the fire on his back and the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like stones. Maylene appeared with a wool blanket, heavy and smelling faintly of cedar. "Barn gets cold. Use this." "Appreciate it." She looked at him directly for the first time since he'd arrived, those green eyes unreadable. "Your horse will be fine. Stone bruise takes time, but it's not the end of the world." "You see a lot of lame horses up here?" "I see a lot of everything up here." She folded her arms. "This valley doesn't get many visitors. The ones we do get are usually running from something, like you said. They stay a few days, heal up, and move on. That what you're planning?" Caleb met her gaze. "That's the plan." "Good. Because we're not a way station and we're not a charity. You work, you eat, you leave. Simple." "Sounds simple." "It is." She took the bowl from his hands. "Barn's unlocked. Don't smoke near the hay." She walked away before he could answer, disappearing into the back of the house. Caleb sat there for another moment, then stood, nodded to the empty room, and let himself out into the cold. The barn was colder than the house but warmer than the trail, and the blanket helped. Caleb made himself a nest in the hayloft, close enough to the horses to hear them breathing, far enough to give them space. He lay back on the straw and stared up at the darkness where the roof beams disappeared into shadow. He'd been running for 3 months. Started in Arizona after everything went to hell, worked his way north through New Mexico and into Colorado, taking jobs when he could find them, sleeping rough when he couldn't. He told himself he was looking for something, new start, clean slate, all the things a man tells himself when the truth is too ugly to look it straight. But the truth was simpler. He was 26 years old, and he'd already buried the only thing he'd ever cared about. A woman named Sarah, dead of fever in a tent city outside Tucson, while he'd been 200 miles away chasing work that didn't matter. By the time he got back, she was already in the ground, and the look in her mother's eyes told him everything he needed to know about who was to blame. So he ran. North, because it was away. Because movement felt like purpose even when it wasn't. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant drowning. The mare shifted in her stall below, restless. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to sleep. He woke to the sound of the barn door opening. Gray light filtered through gaps in the walls, dawn, or close to it. Caleb sat up, hay in his hair, and looked down to see Maylin entering with a bucket in one hand. She moved to the mare's stall, checked the water trough, dumped the bucket in. "You always up this early?" Caleb called down. She didn't startle, just glanced up at him. Animals don't care what time it is. They need what they need. He climbed down the ladder, his back stiff and protesting. Maylin was already examining the mare's leg again, working with the same calm efficiency she'd shown the night before. "How's it look?" Caleb asked. "About the same. She needs rest and time. Push her now, and you'll cripple her." "How much time? 3 days? Maybe 4? Maylin straightened. "My father meant what he said about work. I figured. Can you fix a fence?" "I can." "Good. There's a section up by the north pasture that needs mending before we move the cattle up for summer. You'll start there." She walked past him toward the door. "Breakfast in 20 minutes. Don't be late." She was gone before he could respond. Caleb looked at his horse. The mare looked back, patient and hurting. 3 days, he said to her. "Then we're gone." The mare didn't answer. Breakfast was oatmeal and coffee, eaten in silence while Elias read from a book Caleb couldn't see the title of. Maylin moved around the kitchen with practiced economy, cleaning dishes, banking the fire, preparing for the day with the kind of rhythm that spoke of years doing the same tasks in the same order. When the meal was done, Elias stood. "I'll show you the fence line. Bring your coat." They walked north from the farmhouse, following a trail that climbed gradually along the valley's eastern slope. The sun was up now, turning the snow on the high peaks gold and white, but down in the valley the air was still cold enough to show their breath. Elias moved with the easy stride of a man who'd walked this ground 1,000 times. Caleb followed, watching where he put his feet. "How long you been up here?" Caleb asked. 14 years. Came in after the war. Most men went east looking for work. I went west looking for quiet. Elias glanced back. Found it. Quiet and hard, looks like. The two usually go together. Elias stopped at a fence line that ran along the base of a rocky outcrop. Several posts were leaning, wire sagging between them. "This is yours. Posts need to be reset. Wire tightened. Tools are in the shed by the barn. You know how to dig in rocky soil? I'll figure it out." "You'll do more than figure it out. You'll do it right, or you'll do it again." Elias looked at him directly. "I don't know what you're running from, and I don't care. But while you're here, you pull your weight. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Elias turned to go, then paused. "One more thing. My daughter is not part of your stay here. You treat her with respect, or you'll leave faster than you arrived." Caleb felt his face heat. I didn't say you were. I'm saying you won't." Elias's expression didn't change. She's had enough men look at her like she's something exotic or broken or needing rescue. You'll look at her like a person, or you won't look at all. "Understood." Elias nodded and walked away down the slope, leaving Caleb standing by the broken fence with the morning sun on his face and a warning ringing in his ears. He got to work. Digging post holes in rocky mountain soil was exactly as miserable as he'd expected. The ground was half frozen, studded with stones that turned the shovel blade and bruised his hands through the gloves. By midday, he'd reset 3 posts and his shoulders were screaming. He kept going. Maylene appeared around noon with a canteen of water and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth. "You're going to hurt yourself working that hard," she said, handing him the canteen. Caleb drank, the water cold enough to make his teeth ache. "Your father said do it right." "He says that to everyone. Doesn't mean kill yourself the first day." She nodded at the fence. "You've done good work. That's more than most would manage." "Most haven't had practice being desperate." She gave him a look he couldn't quite read. "You think you're the first desperate man to show up here?" "Didn't say that." "You implied it." She took the canteen back. "We get 2-3 people a year come through this valley. Usually in summer when the pass is clear, sometimes in spring like now. If they're running hard enough not to care about the weather, they all have the same look you do." "What look is that?" "Like they're trying to outrun ghosts." Maylene capped the canteen. "Doesn't work, by the way. Ghosts don't care about distance." Caleb wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. She was right, and they both knew it. "Eat the cornbread," she said. "Dinner's at sundown. Don't be late." She walked away back down the slope toward the farmhouse, and Caleb stood there with the cornbread in his hand watching her go. She moved like someone who belonged to the land, sure-footed and unhurried, and there was something about the way she carried herself that made the whole valley seem smaller and more alive at the same time. He ate the cornbread and went back to work. By the time the sun started to sink, he'd reset 6 posts and was working on the 7th. His hands were blistered, his back was on fire, and he'd lost feeling in his toes an hour ago. But the fence was straight and solid, and when he tested the wire, it sang tight and true. He gathered the tools and headed back down to the barn. Maylene was there, feeding the horses. She glanced at him as he hung the shovel and post-hole digger on their hooks. "Wash up before dinner," she said. "There's a basin by the house." "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am. I'm not old enough for that." "What should I call you?" "Maylene works fine." He nodded and headed for the basin. The water was ice cold, but it felt good on his face, shocking him back into something like alertness. He scrubbed the dirt from his hands and dried off on his sleeve, then walked up to the house. Dinner was venison and beans, served with the same quiet efficiency as breakfast. Elias asked about the fence, and Caleb told him. The older man nodded, satisfied, and that was that. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks on plates and the crackle of the fire. After the meal, Caleb helped clear the table, an automatic gesture from a childhood he barely remembered, and Maylene gave him a look that might have been surprise or approval. He couldn't tell which. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." "Most men wouldn't." "I'm not most men." She almost smiled. Almost. "No, I guess you're not." Elias climbed up to the loft with his book, and Caleb retreated to the barn, carrying his blanket and a tiredness so deep it felt like illness. He climbed into the hayloft, made his nest, and was asleep before he could finish the thought. The next 2 days followed the same pattern. Wake before dawn, breakfast in silence, work on the fence until his body gave out. Eat, sleep, repeat. The posts went up one by one, the wires stretched tight, and the fence line slowly came back to life under his hands. Maylene brought him water and food at midday, but didn't linger. She'd check his progress, make some comment that was half advice and half observation, and then leave him to it. Caleb found himself looking forward to those brief visits more than he wanted to admit. There was something steadying about her presence, like she was proof that people could survive in hard places without losing themselves entirely. On the 3rd day, she stayed longer. He was wrestling a particularly stubborn post into place when she appeared, not with water this time, but with a length of rope. "You're doing that wrong," she said. Caleb looked up, sweating despite the cold. "Am I?" "You're trying to force it. Ground's too hard for that." She handed him the rope. "Loop this around the post, run it through that crack in the rock there, and use leverage. Let the stone do the work." He tried it. The post slid into place like it had been greased. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "Same place I learned everything else. Here." She sat down on a flat rock and watched him work. "My father bought this land when I was 12. We built this farm from nothing. No barn, no house, just land and a creek and a lot of wishful thinking. I learned to work because there wasn't any other choice." "Your mother?" "Dead before we left California." Maylene's voice didn't change, but something in her expression hardened. Fever took her. Same fever that killed half the camp we were living in. "I'm sorry." "Everyone's sorry. Doesn't bring her back." She picked up a pebble and tossed it down the slope. "My father wanted to get away from people, from the cities, from all the looks and the hate and the laws that said we weren't really human. So we came here, middle of nowhere, top of the world, and we built something." Caleb tightened the wire, tested it, moved to the next post. "People leave you alone up here?" "Mostly. We get supplies from the town twice a year, spring and fall. Otherwise, it's just us." She paused. "You think that's lonely?" "I think it's honest." She looked at him then, really looked, and Caleb felt something shift in the air between them. Not attraction exactly, or not just that, but recognition. Like they were both speaking the same language for the first time in years. "You're not what I expected," Maylene said finally. "What'd you expect? Someone louder? Someone who'd make excuses or complaints, or try to explain why they deserve more than they're getting?" She stood, brushing dust from her pants. "You just work. Don't talk much. Don't ask for anything. It's strange." "Strange bad or strange good?" "Haven't decided yet." She started back down the slope, then stopped and looked back. "Your horse is better, by the way. She's putting weight on that leg again. Another day or two and you can leave if you want." Caleb watched her walk away and realized with a cold shock that he wasn't sure he wanted to anymore. That night at dinner, Elias broke the silence. "Fence is done?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Caleb said. "One more section." "Good. After that, there's timber that needs splitting, and the barn roof has some loose shingles, if you're staying longer." Caleb looked at him. "You asking me to stay?" "I'm asking if you're planning to." "My horse is healing up. I should probably what?" Elias set down his fork. "Keep running? Run to where? You got somewhere to be, some job waiting, some reason that matters?" Caleb didn't answer. "Didn't think so." Elias leaned back. "You're a hard worker and you don't complain. That's more than I can say for most. If you want to stay until the spring work is done, you're welcome. I'll pay you fair wage, room and board included. I'm not looking for charity." "This isn't charity, it's a job." Elias's expression didn't change. "You want it or not?" Caleb looked across the table at Maylene. She was watching him with those green eyes, waiting to see what he'd choose. He thought about the trail north, cold and empty and leading nowhere that mattered. He thought about the fence he'd built, solid and real under his hands. He thought about the way this valley felt like the first place in months where he could breathe without choking. "I'll stay," he said. Elias nodded like he'd expected nothing less. "Good. Now eat. Tomorrow starts early." Maylene smiled, actually smiled, brief as lightning but real, and went back to her meal. Caleb ate, and for the first time since Sarah died, he didn't feel like he was drowning. The work changed after that. Instead of a temporary stop, it became something more. A rhythm, a routine, a structure that held him together when his own mind wouldn't. He split timber until his arms went numb. He patched the barn roof under Elias's watchful eye. He cleared brush from the irrigation ditches and helped Maylene doctor a cow with bloat and learned the names of the peaks that ring the valley like silent witnesses. And slowly, carefully, he and Maylene began to talk. Not about the past, neither of them wanted that, but about the small things, the weather, the animals, the way the light hit the mountains at dawn. She taught him which plants were safe to eat and which would kill a man in hours. He showed her a knot his father had taught him for securing loads. They worked side by side, and the silence between them stopped feeling awkward and started feeling comfortable. 3 weeks in, they were mending a gate together when Maylene spoke without looking at him. "Why'd you really come up here?" Caleb hammered a nail, testing his answer. Told you. Horse went lame. That's how you got here, not why. He set down the hammer. I was engaged once, girl named Sarah. She died while I was gone and I wasn't there to do anything about it. So I left. Maylene kept working, her hands steady on the gate. You think running makes it hurt less? No, but it makes it quieter. Quiet's not the same as better. It's close enough. She looked at him then, and her expression was softer than he'd ever seen it. My mother used to say that pain is just love with nowhere to go. You can't outrun that. You can only find somewhere to put it. And where'd you put yours? Here. She gestured at the farm, the valley, the mountains. Every fence post, every crop, every winter we survived. This place is built on grief as much as sweat, maybe more. She went back to the gate. Difference is we stopped running and started building. You should try it. Caleb didn't answer, but that night, lying in the hayloft listening to the horses breathe and the wind move through the rafters, he thought about what she'd said, about pain and love and where to put it, about building instead of running, about staying. The thought scared him more than he wanted to admit, because staying meant caring, and caring meant risking loss all over again. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Maylene's face, serious and strong and alive. And he thought maybe, just maybe, the risk was worth it. He fell asleep thinking about fence posts and green eyes and the way the valley looked when the sun hit it just right. And for the first time in 3 months, he didn't dream about graves. Spring came to the valley in fits and starts. Warm days followed by nights cold enough to freeze water in the troughs. Caleb learned to read the weather by watching how the horses acted and which way Elias looked at the sky in the mornings. He learned that mud season was real and miserable, that the creek could rise 6 inches overnight from snowmelt, and that half the work on a mountain farm was just keeping everything from falling apart faster than you could fix it. He also learned that Maylene Hart was tougher than most men he'd ridden with and twice as smart. She was up before dawn every morning, handling the animals, checking fences, planning the day's work with her father over coffee that could strip paint. She could throw a calf for branding, repair harness leather by lamplight, and outshoot both Caleb and Elias with the old rifle they kept for predators. She did it all without fanfare or complaint, like competence was just the baseline and anything less was embarrassing. It made Caleb want to work harder, and he wasn't entirely sure why. You're staring again, Elias said one morning. They were replacing rotted boards on the barn's south wall, Caleb holding the new plank in place while Elias hammered. Maylene was across the yard breaking ice off the water trough, with more force than strictly necessary. I'm not staring, Caleb said. You are, and you're not subtle. Elias drove another nail home. I told you how things stand. I remember. Then act like it. Elias stepped back, examining the board. She's had men look at her like a puzzle to solve or a prize to win her whole life. White men who think she's exotic. Chinese men who think she's forgotten where she came from. Men who want to rescue her from something she's not suffering from. You understand what I'm saying? Yes, sir. Good. Elias set down the hammer. Because if you're going to be here through the summer, you need to know she's not interested in being anybody's project. She's interested in work and this farm and proving every day that she belongs here as much as the rocks and the trees. You want her respect? You earn it the same way you earn mine. Through what you do, not what you say. Caleb watched Maylene finish with the trough and head toward the chicken coop, moving with that same easy confidence he'd come to recognize. What if I want more than respect? Elias picked up the next board and positioned it. Then you're an even bigger fool than I thought. Now hold this steady. They worked in silence after that, but Caleb's mind was loud enough for both of them. The truth was, he did want more than respect. He wanted to know what made Maylene laugh, really laugh, not just the brief smiles she offered like coins she couldn't afford to spend. He wanted to know what she thought about when she looked at the mountains, whether she ever got lonely up here, whether she'd ever left this valley, or if it was the only world she knew. He wanted things he had no business wanting from a woman whose father had already warned him off, and whose life was complicated in ways he couldn't begin to understand. But wanting didn't care about business or complications or warnings. It just sat in his chest like a stone and got heavier every day. That afternoon, Maylene found him hauling timber from the woodlot to the barn. She appeared without sound, the way she always did, and leaned against a tree watching him work. "You're doing that wrong," she said. Caleb dropped the log he was dragging and straightened, breathing hard. "Seems like I hear that a lot around here." "Because you do a lot of things wrong." She pushed off the tree and walked over. "You're trying to drag the whole thing at once. It's too heavy. You'll hurt your back. I've hauled timber before. Not like this, you haven't." She grabbed the trailing end of the log. "Take the front. We'll carry it together." They lifted in unison, and the log came up clean and balanced. They carried it to the barn in silence, dropped it with the others, and went back for the next one. After the third trip, Caleb spoke without thinking. "Why'd your father bring you up here?" Maylene glanced at him. "I told you, he wanted to get away. But why here specifically? There's easier places to farm. Easy isn't always better." She bent to grab another log. "After my mother died, we were living in a camp outside Sacramento. Gold Rush leftovers, mostly Chinese and Mexican, and whoever else got squeezed out when the mining dried up. My father worked on the railroad until they decided they didn't need Chinese labor anymore. Then he worked whatever jobs he could get. Laundry, cooking, cleaning up after white men who looked at him like dirt." They lifted together and started walking. Caleb kept quiet, sensing she had more to say. "One day a man spit on him, right in the street, in front of everyone. And my father just stood there and took it because fighting back meant jail or worse." Maylene's voice stayed level, but her hands tightened on the log. "That night he told me we were leaving. He'd heard about land up in Colorado, high country, where nobody wanted to settle because it was too hard and too cold and too far from anything that mattered. He said if we were going to break our backs working, we might as well do it for ourselves." They reached the barn and dropped the log. Caleb wiped sweat from his face. "How old were you?" 12. Old enough to understand what we were doing, young enough to think it was an adventure. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Took us 4 months to get here. Walked most of it. By the time we arrived, it was October, and we had nothing but a tent and supplies for 2 weeks. My father built the first shelter with his hands, just him and a borrowed axe and whatever wood he could find. We lived in that one-room shack for 3 years before the house was finished." "That why you're so good at all this?" "I'm good at this because I had to be. My father needed help, and I was the only help available." Maylene looked at him directly. "You learn fast when the alternative is freezing or starving." They went back for more timber. This time Caleb asked the question that had been needling him for weeks. "You ever think about leaving?" "Every day for the first 5 years." She bent to grab another log, her movements practiced and efficient. "I used to dream about cities and people and noise and all the things this valley doesn't have. Then one spring, I realized I'd stopped dreaming about leaving and started dreaming about what we could build here, what this place could become if we just kept working. And now? Now this is home, the only real one I've ever had." She straightened, meeting his eyes. "That scare you? That I'm not going anywhere? Should it?" Most men don't want a woman who's too settled, too sure of herself, too unwilling to follow. Caleb thought about Sarah, who'd wanted nothing more than to follow him wherever the work took them, who died waiting for him to come back from somewhere that didn't matter. "I'm not most men." "So you keep saying." Maylene started walking with the log and Caleb followed. But saying and proving are different things. They worked until the timber was all hauled and stacked. Then Maylene disappeared toward the house to start dinner. Caleb stood in the barn doorway watching the sun sink behind the western peaks and thinking about cities and dreams and women who were too sure of themselves. He'd never wanted anything more in his life. Dinner that night was quiet until Elias broke the silence with an announcement. "Storm's coming. Big one by the look of the sky. We'll need to secure everything tomorrow. Tools, equipment, anything that can blow away. And check the livestock shelter. Last spring storm took half the roof off, and I'm not losing animals because we got lazy." "I'll handle the roof," Caleb said. Elias nodded. "Maylene, you'll need to bring the chickens into the barn. They won't survive a hard blow in that coop." "I know." Maylene was already making a mental list. Caleb could see it in her eyes. "What about supplies? We're low on flour and the salt pork is almost gone." "Won't matter if we can't get to town before the storm hits." Elias considered. "We'll make do. We always do." The storm arrived 2 days later with the kind of violence that made Caleb understand why his father used to say the mountains didn't forgive mistakes. The wind came first, howling down from the peaks like something alive and angry, followed by rain that turned to sleet, and then to snow. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and visibility shrank to nothing. They'd prepared as well as they could, livestock sheltered, tools secured, windows shuttered, but preparation only went so far against weather that didn't care about human plans. Caleb spent the first day helping Elias reinforce the barn door while the wind tried to tear it off its hinges. They worked in near darkness, the lantern swinging wildly, and more than once Caleb thought the whole structure would come apart. Maylene appeared and disappeared like a ghost, checking on the animals, hauling feed, making sure nothing critical got forgotten. She moved through the chaos with the same calm she brought to everything, and watching her made Caleb feel steadier even when the wind was screaming and the walls were shaking. On the second day, the snow got serious. It came down in sheets, piling up faster than seemed possible, drifting against the buildings until the world was nothing but white. Elias declared it too dangerous to go between the barn and the house, so they stayed in the barn, bedding down in the hayloft with the horses and the chickens and the sharp smell of animal warmth. "Worst I've seen in 5 years," Elias said that night, lying on his bedroll with his hat over his face. "Maybe 6. "How long will it last?" Caleb asked. "Until it stops." Maylene, sitting with her back against a hay bale, almost smiled. "That's his way of saying he doesn't know. Could be another day. Could be 3. 3 days of this and we'll run out of feed for the animals." "No, we won't. I planned for a week." She pulled her blanket tighter. "My father taught me to always assume the worst. That way you're ready for it when it shows up." Caleb thought about all the times he hadn't planned for the worst, all the times he'd assumed things would work out because they had to. Sarah dying while he was gone. The mare going lame on a mountain trail. His whole life, basically, lived like the future would take care of itself. "Smart," he said. Maylene looked at him in the lantern light, her face half in shadow. "You sound surprised." "Not surprised, just impressed." "Impressed that a woman can plan ahead?" "Impressed that anyone can. I've never been good at it." "No?" She shifted, turning to face him more directly. "You seem like you're doing fine now." "Now is different." "How?" Caleb hesitated, aware that Elias was probably listening even if he looked asleep. "I've spent the last 3 months running. Didn't plan anything beyond the next day, next town, next job. First time in my life I've stayed anywhere longer than a week was here. And you stayed because your horse went lame." "At first, yeah. Now," he trailed off, not sure how to finish. "Now what?" "Now I'm staying because I want to." The words hung in the air between them. Somewhere below, one of the horses shifted and snorted. The wind screamed against the barn walls. Elias's breathing stayed steady and even. Maylene held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, like he'd passed some test she hadn't told him about. "Good. We need the help." It wasn't a declaration of love or anything close, but it felt like a door opening, just a crack, just enough to let a little light through. Caleb smiled in the darkness and pulled his own blanket up. The storm broke on the 4th day. The wind died first, then the snow tapered off to flurries, and finally to nothing. They emerged from the barn into a world transformed, everything buried under 3 feet of fresh powder, the peaks invisible behind low clouds, the silence so complete it felt like pressure in the ears. "We'll need to dig out," Elias said, surveying the damage. "Paths to the house, the well, the woodshed, and check for leaks. Snow this heavy will find every weak spot in a roof." They spent the next 2 days digging. It was brutal work, clearing paths with shovels that seemed to move more air than snow, but there was satisfaction in it too. Every foot of cleared ground was progress, proof that they were tougher than the weather. Caleb worked alongside Maylene, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm: dig, lift, throw, repeat. She didn't talk much, but she didn't need to. Her presence was enough, steady and sure, and Caleb found himself matching her pace without thinking about it. On the second day of digging, she spoke without looking at him. "You meant what you said? About staying?" Caleb drove his shovel into the snow. "I did." "For how long?" "Don't know." How long you want me to stay? She stopped working and turned to face him. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her breath coming out in clouds, and her green eyes were as direct as ever. That depends. On what? On why you're staying. If it's because you're still running and this seems easier than whatever's out there, then you should leave as soon as the pass clears. We don't need temporary help. And if I'm staying for other reasons, then you need to tell me what those reasons are. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something uncertain. Because I'm not interested in guessing. I've spent too much of my life trying to figure out what men want from me, and I'm tired of it. Caleb set down his shovel. The words he needed felt too big for his mouth, too dangerous to let out. But Maylene was standing there waiting, and he owed her the truth. I'm staying because I want to be here. Because this place feels like something I could build a life on. Because, he took a breath, because you're the first person in a long time who makes me want to stop running. Maylene's expression didn't change, but her shoulders lowered slightly, tension releasing. That's honest. It's all I've got. Honest is enough. She picked up her shovel. But you should know something. I'm not easy to live with. I'm stubborn, and I don't compromise on things that matter, and I won't change who I am to make anyone more comfortable. My father raised me to be strong, not soft, and I'm not interested in being anything else. I'm not asking you to be. You say that now. She started digging again, harder this time. But men always say that. Then they decide they want something different, someone quieter, more accommodating, more willing to follow. And when they realize I'm not that person, they leave. Has that happened before? Once. A man from town came up here 3 summers ago, helped with the harvest, stayed through fall. Her voice was flat, reciting facts. Said he loved me. Said he wanted to marry me and build a life here. Then winter came and he saw what it was really like. The cold, the isolation, the work that never stops. He left before the first snow. Caleb felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sudden. He was an idiot. He was honest about what he could handle. I can respect that at least. Maylene looked at him. Point is, this life isn't romantic. It's hard and sometimes it's lonely, and there's no guarantee we won't lose everything to weather or disease or bad luck. If you can't handle that, you should leave now before either of us gets more invested. And if I can handle it, then prove it, not with words, with time. She went back to digging. Because I'm not interested in maybes or possibilities. I'm interested in what's real. They worked in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who'd said what needed saying and were willing to let the rest unfold however it would. By the time they finished clearing the paths, the sun was breaking through the clouds and the whole valley was glittering with fresh snow. Caleb stood at the edge of the yard, looking at the mountains, and felt something settle in his chest that hadn't been settled in years. He was staying. Not just for the season, not just until his horse healed or the work ran out, but staying in the way a man stays when he's found something worth fighting for. Whether Maylene believed him or not would come down to what he did next. And that was fine. He'd spent too long living on words and promises that meant nothing. It was time to build something real. That night at dinner, Elias made another announcement. Spring planting starts next week. We'll need to clear the fields, prep the soil, and get the seed in before the ground gets too warm. It's the most important work of the year. We do it right. We eat through winter. We do it wrong. We starve. Caleb nodded. I'm ready. Elias studied him across the table. You ever planted a field before? No, sir. Then you'll learn. Maylene will show you. He turned to his daughter. You'll work the north field together. I'll handle the south. We'll meet in the middle and see who finishes first. Maylene raised an eyebrow. Since when do we race? Since we have extra hands, and I want to see if they're worth keeping. Elias's expression was neutral, but Caleb caught the glint in his eye. Call it a test. A test for who? Maylene asked. Both of you. The planting started 3 days later when the ground had dried enough to work. Maylene led Caleb to the north field, a sloping plot about 2 acres in size, rocky and stubborn-looking, and handed him a hoe. We'll work in rows, she said. I'll mark them, you'll dig the furrows. Has to be straight, and the depth has to be consistent or the seeds won't take. Think you can handle that? I can handle it. Good. Because my father's watching even when it looks like he's not, and he doesn't give second chances. They fell into the work with the kind of intensity that left no room for talk. Maylene moved ahead, dragging a line to mark the rows, while Caleb followed behind, turning the soil with the hoe. It was back-breaking labor. Every stroke jarred his arms and shoulders, but he kept at it, matching her pace, refusing to slow down or complain. By midday, they'd completed a quarter of the field. Maylene called a break, and they sat in the shade of the wagon, passing a water jug back and forth. "You're faster than I expected," she said. "Should I be insulted?" "No, just surprised." She took another drink. "Most men would have quit by now, or at least asked for a longer break." "I told your father I wanted to stay. Can't do that if I don't pull my weight." Maylene looked at him, something thoughtful in her expression. "You really mean that, don't you? About staying?" "I do." "Why?" Caleb leaned back against the wagon wheel, watching the clouds drift over the peaks. "Because I've spent my whole life moving, one town to the next, one job to the next, never putting down roots because I was afraid of what would happen if I stayed still too long. Then Sarah died, and I realized all that moving didn't protect me from anything, just made me lonelier. And you think staying here will fix that? I think staying here will give me something to work for instead of running from." He looked at her. "And I think you're the kind of person worth working beside." Maylene held his gaze for a long moment, then stood and brushed dirt from her pants. "Come on, we're burning daylight." They worked until sunset and finished half the field. Elias came by to inspect their progress, walking the rows with his hands behind his back, checking depth and straightness like a general reviewing troops. "Acceptable," he said finally. Maylene smiled. "That's practically a compliment coming from you. Don't let it go to your head. You've still got half a field to finish." They finished the north field in 3 more days. It was grueling work that left Caleb's hands raw and his back screaming, but every evening when they stood at the edge of the completed rows, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the shallow pride of finishing a job, but the deeper satisfaction of building something that would last beyond the moment. Maylene felt it too, he could tell. She'd stand beside him looking at the field, her arms crossed, and there'd be this quiet contentment in her posture that said more than words ever could. "You did good work," she said one evening. "We did good work." "Yeah." She glanced at him. "We did." They walked back to the farmhouse together as the light failed and the temperature dropped. Caleb wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that these past weeks had meant something to him, that working beside her had been the best part of his days, but the words felt too big and clumsy, so he kept quiet. Maylene seemed content with the silence anyway. The planting finished in mid-April. They celebrated with a meal that was bigger than usual: roasted chicken, fresh bread, early greens from Maylene's garden, and afterward Elias brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for something worth drinking too. "To the crop," he said, raising his glass. "To the crop," Maylene and Caleb echoed. They drank, and the whiskey burned going down but warmed everything it touched. Elias poured another round. "You did good this season," he said to Caleb. "Better than I expected, truth be told. You've earned your keep, and then some." "Appreciate that, sir." "Don't appreciate it, just keep doing it." Elias leaned back in his chair. "I'm getting older, and this work doesn't get easier. I could use someone reliable around here. You interested in staying on permanent?" Caleb felt Maylene's eyes on him, waiting to see what he'd say. "I'm interested." "It's not an easy life. You've seen a taste of it, but you haven't seen a full year. Winter up here can break a man if he's not ready for it." "I'll be ready." "Will you?" Elias's expression was serious. "Because once you commit, you're committed. I don't want someone who'll leave when the work gets hard or the weather gets worse. I need someone who'll stick." "I'll stick." Elias studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. We'll draw up terms after the first harvest. Until then, you keep working like you have been, and we'll see where we stand." It wasn't a promise exactly, but it was close enough. That night, lying in the hayloft with the horses breathing below and the stars visible through gaps in the roof, Caleb thought about permanence and commitment and all the things he'd spent his life avoiding. He thought about Sarah and how losing her had taught him that running didn't protect against pain. It just guaranteed loneliness. And he thought about Mei-lan, sharp and strong and utterly herself, and realized he wanted to build something with her that would last longer than a season. The question was whether she wanted the same thing. He'd find out soon enough. Summer came to the valley with a violence that surprised Caleb. The snow melted fast, turning the creek into a torrent that chewed at its banks and threatened the lower fields. The temperature swung wildly, freezing at night, blazing during the day, and everything that had been dormant under winter suddenly exploded into growth. The work shifted from planting to maintaining, endless hours spent weeding, irrigating, checking fences, and fighting back the wilderness that wanted to reclaim every inch of cleared ground. Caleb threw himself into it with something close to desperation. He wanted Elias to see him as indispensable. More than that, he wanted Mei-lan to see him as someone who could match her, stride for stride, and never ask her to slow down or be less than she was. But wanting something and earning it were different animals entirely. The problem started small. A disagreement over how to repair a section of irrigation ditch that kept washing out. Mei-lan wanted to reinforce it with stone, a permanent solution that would take days. Caleb suggested using timber, faster and easier. They argued about it in the field until Elias walked over and settled it without a word. They'd do it Mei-lan's way because her way would last. Caleb bit back his frustration and helped haul stone for the next 3 days. Then there was the incident with the cattle. They were moving the herd to higher pasture and Caleb tried to push them too fast, spooking a cow that nearly went over a ledge. Mei-lan grabbed the animal's halter and pulled it back with strength that seemed impossible for her size, then turned on Caleb with eyes that could have cut glass. "You trying to kill my livestock, or are you just stupid? I was trying to move them faster." "Faster isn't always better. You've been here long enough to know that." She checked the cow for injuries, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "You push animals on a mountain trail, they panic, they die. And we can't afford to lose a single head because you're in a hurry." "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring back a dead cow." She released the animal and it trotted off to rejoin the herd. "You want to help? Then pay attention and think before you act." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing there feeling like a scolded child. That night at dinner, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Elias noticed but said nothing, just ate his meal and watched them both with the kind of patience that made Caleb nervous. Mei-lan barely looked at him, focusing on her plate like it contained answers to questions she wasn't asking. Finally, Caleb couldn't take it anymore. "I made a mistake today. I'm sorry." Mei-lan set down her fork. "I know you are." "Then why are you still angry?" "Because sorry doesn't teach you anything. It's just a word." She looked at him directly. "You want to stay here? You need to understand that everything we do matters. Every decision, every action, every shortcut we don't take. This farm is all we have. We can't afford mistakes. I understand that. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're still thinking like someone passing through, someone who can make a mistake and move on because it's not really his problem." The words hit harder than Caleb expected. "That's not fair." "Fair or not, it's true." Mei-lan pushed back from the table. "You've been here 4 months. That's nothing. A season. You haven't seen what winter does to this place, how hard it gets when the snow won't stop and the supplies run low and every day is just fighting to stay alive. You haven't earned the right to take risks with things that aren't yours. They could be mine, if you'd let them." The room went silent. Elias set down his cup slowly, watching them both. Mei-lan's expression didn't change. "What's that supposed to mean?" Caleb felt the words building in his throat, too big to swallow back. "It means I'm not passing through. It means I want to stay, really stay, and build something here. With you." "With me?" "Yes. Because you've decided that after 4 months of work, you're ready to commit to a life you barely understand?" Her voice was level, but there was something dangerous underneath it. "Or because you think I'm some kind of prize you can win if you work hard enough?" "That's not—" "Then what is it, Caleb? Because I need to know." She stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to know if you're staying because this is where you want to be, or if you're staying because you're still running from whatever you left behind, and I just happen to be here." Caleb stood too, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I'm staying because I want to be here, because I want to build a life with you. Because every day I'm here makes me more certain that this is where I'm supposed to be. Supposed to be. Maylene shook her head. You sound like you think this is fate or destiny or some story where everything works out because it has to. That's not how life works. Not up here. I know that. Do you? She moved toward the door. Because I think you're still living in a fantasy where love fixes everything and wanting something badly enough makes it real. I don't have time for fantasies. I have work to do. She walked out into the night, leaving Caleb standing there with his heart hammering and his mouth full of things he couldn't say. Elias stood slowly, stretching his back. You handled that poorly. I know. You pushed too hard. She's not a horse you can break or a field you can force into submission. Elias walked to the door and looked out at the darkness where Maylene had disappeared. She spent her whole life proving she belongs here. The land, the work, the life. She's earned all of it through blood and sweat and refusing to quit when everything said she should. You can't just walk in and claim a piece of that because you've had a hard few months. I'm not trying to claim anything. Aren't you? Elias turned back. You told her you want to build a life with her. That's claiming, and she's not wrong to question it. You've been here 1 season. She's been here 14 years. From where she's standing, you're still a stranger. The words landed like stones in Caleb's chest. So what do I do? You keep working, you keep proving, and you stop expecting her to meet you halfway when you haven't even walked the full path yet. Elias grabbed his hat. She'll come around if you're patient, but if you push again like you did tonight, she'll shut you out for good. He left Caleb alone in the house, with the fire burning low, and the night pressing against the windows. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He lay in the hayloft listening to the horses and replaying every word of the argument, trying to understand where he'd gone wrong. Maylene was right. He had been thinking like someone passing through, someone who could afford mistakes because he wasn't fully invested. But he was invested now, more than he'd been in anything since Sarah died, and the thought of losing this place, this life, this woman, made him feel like he was drowning. By morning, he'd made a decision. He found Maylene in the barn feeding the horses. She didn't acknowledge him when he walked in, just kept working with that same focused intensity she brought to everything. I'm sorry, he said. She poured grain into a trough. You said that already. I know, but I need to say it again. He moved closer. You were right about all of it. I have been thinking like someone who doesn't fully understand what's at stake here, and I pushed when I should have waited. Maylene finished with the grain and turned to face him. Her expression was guarded. And I want to do better, not just say it, do it. So I'm asking, what do I need to prove to you? What would it take for you to believe I'm serious about staying? She studied him for a long moment. You want an answer? I do. Then here it is. Stop talking about the future like it's guaranteed. Stop making promises about forever when you haven't made it through a single year. Just work. Just be here. And when winter comes, if you're still standing at the end of it, we'll talk. She picked up the empty grain bucket. Until then, I don't want to hear about building a life together or what you want from me. I want to see what you do when things get hard. Fair enough? Is it? She moved past him toward the door. Because I'm not promising you anything, Caleb. Not hope, not affection, not even friendship. You stay because you want to stay, not because you think it'll lead somewhere. I understand. Good. She paused in the doorway. And for what it's worth, I hope you make it. But hope isn't enough, never has been. She walked out and left him standing in the barn with sunlight slanting through the gaps in the walls and the certainty that he'd just been given both a test and a warning. The next weeks were harder than anything Caleb had faced before. Not because the work was worse, it wasn't, but because he had to do it without the promise of anything beyond the next day. Maylene was polite but distant, treating him like a hired hand rather than someone she'd shared meals and conversations and long silences with. Elias watched everything with his usual quiet patience, offering neither encouragement nor criticism. Caleb kept his head down and worked. They brought in the first hay cutting in early July, long days of mowing and raking and stacking that left everyone exhausted. Caleb worked alongside Maylene in the fields, matching her pace, and she acknowledged his effort with nods, but nothing more. At night, he'd collapse in the hayloft and stare at the darkness, wondering if he was making progress or just delaying the inevitable. Then the cattle got sick. It started with one cow showing up lame and feverish. Maylene isolated it immediately, but by the next morning, 3 more were showing symptoms. By the end of the week, half the herd was sick and 2 were dead. "Blackleg," Elias said, standing over the latest casualty. "Haven't seen it this bad in years." "Can we stop it all?" Caleb asked. "Maybe, if we're lucky." Elias looked at Maylene. "You know what to do." She nodded, her face grim. "We'll need to separate the sick ones completely, burn the carcasses, and hope we caught it early enough." The next week was a nightmare of constant vigilance. They worked in shifts, watching the herd, treating the sick animals with what little medicine they had, and burning the bodies of those that didn't make it. The smoke hung over the valley like a shroud, and the smell of death was everywhere. Caleb volunteered for the night shifts, giving Maylene and Elias time to rest. He'd sit with the cattle in the darkness, listening to them breathe, checking for fever, doing what little he could. It was during one of those nights, 3 in the morning, with the stars cold and bright overhead, that he understood what Maylene had meant about earning his place. This wasn't romantic. It wasn't an adventure. It was just hard, grinding work with no guarantee of success and the constant threat of losing everything. And if he couldn't handle this, couldn't find meaning in it even when it was ugly and exhausting, then he had no business being here. By the end of the second week, they'd lost 5 cattle total, but the rest were recovering. It could have been worse. Elias said so at dinner one night, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Could have lost the whole herd. We got lucky." "Luck and good management," Maylene said. She looked at Caleb. "You did good work." "Thank you." It was the first real acknowledgement she'd given him in weeks, and it hit harder than he expected. "Just doing what needed doing," he said. "That's exactly right." She almost smiled. "That's all any of us can do." After that, things shifted slightly, not back to how they'd been before the argument, but to something new and more solid. Maylene stopped treating him like a stranger and started treating him like someone who'd proven he could be counted on. They worked together with less tension, their conversations coming easier, and occasionally Caleb would catch her looking at him with an expression that might have been approval or might have been something more. He didn't push, didn't ask, just kept working. August brought the second hay cutting and the first real harvest from the garden. They spent long days preserving food for winter, drying beans, pickling vegetables, smoking meat, and Caleb learned that survival in the mountains meant thinking months ahead, always preparing for the worst. One evening, he and Maylene were working in the root cellar, organizing the stores, when she spoke without looking at him. "You've made it further than most." Caleb set down the box he was carrying. "Most what?" "Most men who say they want to stay." She adjusted a shelf. "Usually by now they've either left or I've sent them away. But you're still here." "I told you I would be." "People tell me a lot of things." She turned to face him in the dim light. "Doesn't mean they're true. Has anyone ever kept their promises to you?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "My father has." "That's about it." "That's a lonely way to live." "Lonely or not, it's realistic." She moved past him toward the stairs. "Come on, we're losing daylight." They climbed up into the evening air and Caleb followed her back to the house, thinking about promises and proof and the difference between the two. That night after dinner, Elias made an announcement that changed everything. "I'm going to town next week. Need to arrange the fall supply run and talk to some people about selling cattle. I'll be gone 3, maybe 4 days." He looked at Caleb. "Think you can manage things here while I'm gone?" Caleb felt the weight of the question. "Yes, sir." "You'll be taking orders from Maylene. What she says goes. Understood?" "Understood." Elias turned to his daughter. "You comfortable with that arrangement?" Maylene looked at Caleb, measuring something. "I am." "Good. Then it's settled." Elias stood. "I leave Monday morning. Don't burn the place down while I'm gone." Monday came too fast. Elias left before dawn with the wagon and 2 horses, leaving Caleb and Maylene alone on the farm for the first time since he'd arrived. The silence after Elias disappeared over the ridge was enormous. "Well," Maylene said, "let's get to work." The first day went smoothly. They handled the morning chores, repaired a section of fence that had come loose, and spent the afternoon working in the garden. It felt strange being alone together without Elias as a buffer, but it also felt right, like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. That night at dinner, Maylene surprised him. "You want to know why I'm so hard on you?" Caleb set down his fork. "I figured you had your reasons." "I do, and you deserve to know what they are." She took a breath. "That man I told you about, the one who stayed through fall and left before winter, his name was Thomas. He was kind and hardworking, and he said all the right things. He told me he loved me. He told me he wanted to marry me and spend his life here, and I believed him." "What happened?" "November happened. First real cold snap, temperature dropped to 20 below, and stayed there for a week. The well froze, the livestock shelter lost part of its roof, and we ran out of firewood because we'd underestimated how much we'd need. It was bad." She looked at her hands. Thomas couldn't handle it. The cold, the isolation, the constant work just to survive. He kept saying it would get better, that we just needed to make it to spring, but I could see it in his eyes. He was already gone. So he left. He left. Told me he was going to town for supplies and never came back. I found out later he'd caught a stage east, and that was that. Her voice stayed steady, but Caleb could hear the pain underneath. "I was angry for a long time, not because he left, but because he'd made me believe he wouldn't. He'd made me hope for something that was never going to happen. I'm not Thomas. Maybe not. But you're still a man who showed up here running from something, and I don't know if you're running to this place or just away from everything else." She met his eyes. "That's why I'm hard on you, because I can't afford to hope again if it's not real." Caleb understood then what he was really being asked to prove. Not just that he could work or handle hardship, but that he could be trusted with something more fragile than any of that, her willingness to believe in someone again. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true, and I'll keep saying it until you believe me." Maylene held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once and went back to her meal. They finished eating in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, warmer somehow, less guarded. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. The night was cool but not cold, and the valley was so quiet Caleb could hear the creek running 100 yards away. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Every day for the first 5 years. I told you that." "I mean now. Do you ever want something different?" Maylene considered. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to live somewhere easier. A town where I could buy food instead of growing it, where winter didn't mean fighting to survive, where I wouldn't have to prove myself every single day." She paused. "But then I remember that every other place I've lived, I was invisible, or worse. Here, I built something. I matter. And that's worth more than easy." "You'd matter anywhere." "That's a nice thing to say, but it's not true." She looked at him. "You don't know what it's like being Chinese in white spaces. Always on the outside, always being looked at like you don't belong. My father and I came here because it was the only place no one could tell us we didn't have the right to exist. Up here, we don't need permission. We just need to work." Caleb thought about Sarah, about belonging and not belonging, about all the ways people decided who mattered and who didn't. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, just understand." She stood. "I'm going to bed. Morning comes early." She went inside, and Caleb sat there alone, thinking about everything she'd told him, about Thomas, and broken promises, and the cost of hope, about what it meant to earn someone's trust when they'd learned the hard way not to give it. He was still sitting there when the moon rose over the eastern peaks, turning the valley silver and strange. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Caleb and Maylene worked together without Elias's steady presence, and in his absence they found their own way of communicating. Fewer words, more understanding, a developing shorthand built on months of shared labor. On the third day they were cleaning the barn when Maylene stopped suddenly, her head cocked. "You hear that?" Caleb listened. At first he heard nothing, then caught it, a faint bleating from somewhere up the slope. "Sheep?" "We don't have sheep. Must be wild." She grabbed a rope. "Come on. If it's caught in something, we need to help." They found the animal about a quarter-mile up the mountain, tangled in deadfall with one leg at an angle that looked wrong. Maylene approached slowly, speaking in a low voice, and the sheep stopped struggling. "Broken," she said after examining the leg. "Can't leave it like this." "You gonna shoot it?" "Not if I can help it." She looked at him. "You know how to splint a leg?" "On a horse, maybe. Never tried it on a sheep. Same principle. Hold her steady." Caleb held the animal while Maylene worked, her hands quick and sure. Fashioning a splint from straight branches and strips of cloth, she tore from her shirt without hesitation. The sheep struggled, but Maylene kept talking to it, low and calm, and eventually it settled. "There." She sat back. "Won't be perfect, but it'll heal if we keep her quiet." "We're keeping her? Can't just leave her up here. She won't survive." Maylene looked at the sheep, then at Caleb. "You carry her down. I'll get the gate ready." Caleb picked up the sheep, heavier than it looked, and started down the slope. Maylene walked ahead, clearing the path, and by the time they reached the barn, he was breathing hard, and the sheep was making sounds of protest. They set her up in an empty stall with water and hay. Maylene checked the splint one more time, adjusting it, then stepped back. "She'll either make it or she won't. All we can do is give her a chance." Caleb looked at her. At this woman who'd just torn up her own shirt to save an animal that wasn't even hers, and felt something shift in his chest. "You're a good person, Maylene Hart." She turned to him, surprised. "What brought that on?" "Just seeing you work, how you care about things, even a random sheep that probably belongs to someone else. It's not about being good, it's about doing what needs doing." But her expression had softened. "You helped. You told me to. Most men wouldn't have. Most men would have said it's just a sheep and not worth the trouble. It was worth it to you. That makes it worth it to me." Maylene looked at him for a long moment, and Caleb saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not just approval or respect, but something warmer, something that might have been the beginning of trust. "Come on," she said finally. "Let's get cleaned up for dinner." That evening they ate on the porch again, watching the sun sink behind the peaks. The sheep was quiet in the barn, the farm was running smoothly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Caleb felt like he might actually belong here. "My father will be back tomorrow," Maylene said. "I know. You did good while he was gone, didn't fall apart, didn't make any stupid decisions, didn't try to change how we do things." "Was that another test?" "Everything's a test up here. Survival is one long test." She set down her plate. "But yeah, it was. And you passed." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Maylene stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the darkening valley. "I want to show you something tomorrow morning before my father gets back. Will you come with me?" "Where?" "You'll see." The next morning, Maylene woke him before dawn. They ate a quick breakfast in silence. Then she led him up the eastern slope on a trail he'd never taken before. They climbed for an hour, the air getting thinner and colder, until they reached a rocky outcrop that jutted out over the valley like a ship's prow. The view was staggering. The whole valley spread out below them, the farm tiny and perfect, the creek a silver thread, the mountains rising in every direction like walls holding back the world. "This is where I come when I need to think," Maylene said. "When everything feels too small or too hard or too much. I come up here and remember what we built." Caleb looked at her standing against the sunrise, her hair moving in the wind, and understood that this was something she'd never shown Thomas or anyone else. This was her place, and she was sharing it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For trusting me enough to bring me here." Maylene turned to face him, and in the growing light her green eyes were bright and clear. "I'm starting to believe you might actually stay, that you might be who you say you are." "I am." "Then prove it one more time." She moved closer, and Caleb's heart started hammering. "Ask my father properly, for permission to court me. Do it the right way, with respect and honesty, and accept whatever answer he gives. And if he says no, then you accept it and you stay anyway, because you're here for the work and the life, not just for me." Her expression was serious. "Can you do that?" Caleb thought about everything he'd been through to get here, the running, the grief, the slow rebuilding of something he'd thought was dead. He thought about Elias and his warnings and his tests. And he thought about Maylene, standing here on this mountaintop offering him a chance at something real. I can do that. Good. She stepped back. Then let's go. My father will be home soon and we've got work to do. They walked back down the mountain together as the sun climbed and the valley came to life below them, and Caleb felt like he was finally walking towards something instead of away from it. Elias returned that afternoon with a wagon full of supplies and news from town. He seemed satisfied with how things had gone in his absence, nodding approvingly when he saw the work they'd done and the condition of the animals. That night after dinner, while Maylene was outside checking the sheep, Caleb asked to speak with Elias alone. The older man looked at him with those sharp eyes. Something on your mind? Yes, sir. I want to ask your permission to court your daughter. Elias leaned back in his chair, studying him. That's a serious request. I'm serious about it. Are you? Elias stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. You've been here 6 months. That's longer than most, but still not long. What makes you think you're ready for that kind of commitment? Because I love her, and because I want to build a life here, with her, if she'll have me. Love? Elias turned back. You know what love means on a mountain farm? It means work. It means sacrifice. It means staying when everything in you wants to run. It means watching someone you care about break themselves on this land and knowing you can't protect them from it, only help them through it. He moved closer. Thomas said he loved her too. He was lying, whether he knew it or not. So I need to know, are you lying? No, sir. Then answer me this. If she says no, if I say no, if this never goes anywhere beyond what it is right now, will you still stay? Caleb met his eyes without flinching. I will. Why? Because I belong here. Not because of what I hope to get from it, but because of what I can give to it. This place needs work, and I need purpose, and they fit together. Maylene's part of that, the biggest part, but even without her, I'd stay. Elias studied him for a long time, so long that Caleb thought he might say no just to make a point. Then the older man's face softened, just slightly. You've done good work these past months, better than good. And my daughter respects you, which is harder to earn than my permission. He extended his hand. You have my blessing to court her properly, but understand, this doesn't mean you've won anything. It just means you've earned the right to try. Caleb shook his hand, relief and gratitude flooding through him. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Thank her if she says yes, and if she says no, you accept it like a man. I will. Elias nodded and climbed up to the loft, leaving Caleb alone with a heart that felt too big for his chest. He found Maylene by the creek, sitting on the bank with her boots off and her feet in the water. The moon was up, turning everything silver. Can I sit? He asked. She nodded, and he settled beside her, the cold water shocking against his skin. Your father gave his permission, Caleb said. Maylene didn't look at him. I know. He told me he would if you asked the right way. And you, what do you say? She was quiet for a long time, so long that Caleb started to prepare himself for rejection. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. I say yes, but on my terms. She turned to face him. We do this slow. No rushing, no promises about forever, no expectations beyond what we build together day by day. I need to know you're real, Caleb, that this is real, and the only way to know that is time. However much time you need. It might be a lot. I might be difficult about it. I might test you in ways that seem unfair. I can handle difficult. Can you? She almost smiled. Because I'm not going to make this easy just because my heart wants it to be. I don't want easy. I want real. Maylene reached out and took his hand, her fingers rough with work and warm against his skin. Then let's see what real looks like. They sat there by the creek as the water rushed past and the night settled around them. Two people who'd both learned the hard way that hope was dangerous but also necessary, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was try again, The courting, as Maylene had warned, was nothing like the stories Caleb had heard growing up. There were no stolen kisses in the moonlight, no romantic gestures that swept anyone off their feet. Instead, there was work, and the slow building of something that felt more solid than any declaration of love ever could. They worked side by side through the rest of summer and into fall, their conversations coming easier but never crossing certain lines. Maylene made it clear without saying it outright that proximity wasn't the same as intimacy, that working together didn't mean she was ready to let him into the deeper parts of herself. Caleb respected that boundary even when it frustrated him, because he understood what she was really asking for, proof that he could be patient, that he could wait without demanding. The harvest came in strong that year. The fields they'd planted together in spring yielded better than Elias had hoped, and they spent long days bringing in wheat and oats and potatoes, filling the root cellar until it groaned with supplies. The work was brutal, endless hours of cutting and hauling and storing, but there was satisfaction in it too. Every full bin was proof of what they'd built together, what they could survive on when winter came. And winter was coming. Caleb could feel it in the air, in the way the light changed and the wind shifted. The peaks that had been bare rock all summer were frosted with snow, and the mornings came colder each week. "First snow will be here by mid-October," Elias said one evening in late September. "Maybe sooner if we get unlucky. You ready for that?" Caleb looked at him across the dinner table. "As ready as I can be." Being ready and thinking you're ready are different things. Elias set down his fork. Winter up here isn't like winter anywhere else. It's not just cold, it's isolation. We won't see another person for 5, maybe 6 months. The pass closes and we're cut off completely. Just us, the animals, and whatever we've stored up. You understand what that means? I think so. You think so? Elias shook his head. Maylene, tell him. Maylene had been quiet through the meal, which wasn't unusual, but now she looked at Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. He means that winter will show you things about yourself you didn't know were there. Good things and bad things. It'll test your patience, your sanity, your ability to live with the same 2 people day after day with nowhere to go and nothing to break the routine. Some people can't handle that. They crack. Thomas cracked, Caleb said. Thomas cracked. Maylene's voice was flat. And I need to know if you will too. I won't. You can't know that until you've been through it. She was right, and they all knew it. All Caleb could do was wait and prove it when the time came. The preparation for winter consumed the next month. They sealed cracks in the buildings with mud and moss, reinforced the roofs against heavy snow, moved firewood closer to the house until they had enough stacked to burn for months. Maylene showed Caleb how to preserve meat and salt, how to ration supplies, how to keep track of what they used so they'd know if they needed to stretch it further. We've made it through on less, she said one afternoon while they were organizing the food stores. But less means hungry, and hungry means weak, and weak means mistakes. Better to have too much than not enough. Your father teach you that? Experience taught me that. My first winter here, we ran out of flour in February, had to make do with just potatoes and dried meat for 6 weeks. I was so sick of potatoes by the time spring came, I couldn't look at them for a year. She adjusted a sack of beans. Never again. Caleb helped her finish the inventory, and they climbed back up into the fading daylight. The valley was already starting to look different, the grass gone yellow, the trees losing their leaves, everything settling into dormancy. It felt like the land was holding its breath, waiting. That night, Maylene asked him to walk with her after dinner. They left Elias reading by the fire and headed up the trail toward the overlook where she'd taken him before. The moon was nearly full, turning the valley silver and strange. I need to tell you something, she said when they reached the outcrop. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. All right. I'm scared. She said it simply, without drama, like she was commenting on the weather. Of winter, of what might happen, of whether you'll make it through. And I'm angry at myself for being scared because I know better than to invest in something that might not last. I'm going to last. You keep saying that, but the truth is you don't know. None of us do. She turned to face him, the moonlight catching her eyes and making them glow. I've spent years building walls around myself. telling myself that being alone is safer than being hurt. And you've been taking those walls apart, brick by brick, just by being here and working and not leaving. And now winter's coming, and I'm terrified that when it's over, you'll be gone, and I'll have to build those walls all over again." Caleb wanted to promise her it wouldn't happen, wanted to swear he'd never leave, but Maylene had been clear about not wanting empty promises. So instead, he told her the truth. "I'm scared too. I'm scared I'll fail somehow, that I won't be strong enough or tough enough or whatever it takes to make it through. I'm scared your father will regret giving me a chance and that you'll regret saying yes." He moved closer. "But I'm more scared of running again, of spending the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd just stayed and fought for something worth fighting for." Maylene looked at him for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. "Then let's be scared together, and let's see what happens when winter ends." They stood there on the mountainside, holding hands like teenagers, two people who'd both learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. The first snow came on October 12th, earlier than Elias had predicted. Caleb woke in the hayloft to silence and knew immediately something had changed. He climbed down and opened the barn door to find the world transformed, everything white and still, the valley floor hidden under 6 inches of fresh powder. Maylene appeared from the house bundled in a heavy coat, her breath clouding in the air. "It's early. We'll get more before the month is out." "How much more?" "Hard to say. Could be feet, could be yards." She looked at the sky, reading something in the clouds that Caleb couldn't see. "Either way, we're in it now. No backing out." They spent the day making final adjustments, bringing the last of the loose supplies under cover, checking the animals one more time, making sure everything was as ready as it could be. By nightfall, the snow had stopped and the temperature had dropped to brutal, the kind of cold that made breathing hurt. That night at dinner, Elias raised his cup. "To winter. May we all see spring." They drank, and Caleb felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. The first weeks were the hardest, not because of the work, but because of the adjustment. The routine became rigid by necessity. Up before dawn to tend the animals, break ice on the water troughs, check for damage from overnight storms. Breakfast. Work whatever needed working. Lunch. More work. Dinner. Sleep. Repeat. The days were short, the nights endless. By 4 in the afternoon, full darkness had fallen, and there was nothing to do but huddle by the fire and try not to think about how many months stretched ahead before the sun would stay up past dinner time again. Caleb learned quickly that Elias hadn't been exaggerating about the isolation. The pass closed completely by early November, buried under drifts too deep to navigate. They were cut off from everything. No mail, no supplies, no news from the outside world. Just the 3 of them, and the animals, and the valley that had become both home and prison. He also learned that Maylin had been right about winter revealing things. By the 3rd week, he discovered that he hated being confined, that too much stillness made him restless and irritable. He'd pace the barn at odd hours, inventing work that didn't need doing just to have something to occupy his hands. Maylene noticed but didn't comment, which somehow made it worse. Then one night she found him in the barn past midnight, reorganizing tools that were already organized. "Can't sleep?" she asked. Caleb jumped, not having heard her approach. "Something like that. You're going to wear yourself out finding things to fix that aren't broken. Better than going crazy doing nothing." Maylene sat down on a hay bale, wrapping her coat tighter. "My first winter here, I thought I'd lose my mind. I was 13 and used to noise and people and constant movement. Up here there was nothing, just quiet and cold and the same 4 walls every day. I tried to convince my father to leave, told him we'd made a mistake coming here. What'd he say? He said the quiet wasn't the problem. The problem was I was afraid of what I'd hear if I actually listened to it." She paused. He was right. Once I stopped fighting the quiet, stopped trying to fill it with noise, I started hearing other things. The wind, the creak under the ice, the way the cabin settled at night. And I started hearing myself too. What I actually thought and felt instead of what I thought I should think and feel. Caleb set down the hammer he'd been holding. "You saying I should embrace the quiet? I'm saying you should stop running from it. You've been running your whole life, from grief, from responsibility, from yourself. Winter won't let you do that. It'll make you sit still whether you want to or not. Might as well learn something from it. She left him alone after that, but her words stayed. Caleb tried to take them to heart, tried to let himself sit with the silence instead of fighting it, but it was harder than he expected. In the quiet, Sarah's ghost came back. So did all the mistakes he'd made, all the times he'd chosen wrong, or not chosen at all. The quiet was full of voices, and none of them were kind. But slowly, as the weeks passed, something shifted. The voices got quieter. The restlessness eased. Caleb found himself able to sit by the fire in the evenings without needing to jump up and do something. He started reading from Elias's collection of books, started having conversations that lasted hours about nothing in particular, started learning the difference between loneliness and solitude. And he started really seeing Maylene not just as someone he wanted, but as someone who'd learned to thrive in conditions that would have broken most people. She moved through winter with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything, never complaining about the cold or the dark or the monotony. She'd cook elaborate meals just to break the routine, teach Caleb card games her mother had taught her, tell stories about California and the camps and the journey north that had nearly killed them both. One night in late November, while Elias slept in the loft and the fire burned low, Maylene told Caleb about her mother's death. She got sick on the road. We were 2 weeks outside Sacramento and she started coughing. My father wanted to stop, find a doctor, but she insisted we keep going, said she'd be fine once we got to where the air was cleaner. Maylene stared into the flames. She wasn't fine. She got worse every day. By the time we reached Denver, she could barely stand. We found a doctor, but he wouldn't treat her because we couldn't pay and because she was Chinese. My father begged. I begged. Didn't matter. He said, I'm sorry. She died in a boarding house 2 days later. The owner wouldn't let us keep her body in the room, said it was bad for business. So my father carried her out to the edge of town and buried her in the dark where no one would see. Her voice never wavered, but her hands were clenched tight. I was 12 years old, and I learned that night that the world doesn't care about fairness or suffering or how much you love someone. It only cares about what you can take from it by force. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he reached out and covered her hands with his. She let him, and they sat like that until the fire died to embers and the cold started creeping in. December brought the worst of the cold. The temperature dropped to 40 below and stayed there for 2 weeks straight. They burned through firewood faster than anticipated, and Caleb had to venture out into the brutal cold to chop more, his fingers going numb even through heavy gloves. Everything was a fight, keeping the animals alive, keeping themselves alive, keeping the buildings from being crushed under snow that piled up faster than they could clear it. One morning, Caleb woke to find ice inside the cabin, frost coating the walls despite the fire that had burned all night. Elias took one look and declared it too dangerous to do anything but stay inside and conserve heat. They spent 3 days barely moving, huddled together by the fire, rationing food to make it last. The animals had to fend for themselves in the barn with whatever shelter they had. It was the closest Caleb had come to giving up since arriving, the cold seeping so deep into his bones he couldn't imagine ever being warm again. On the 3rd day, the cold broke just enough for them to venture outside. They found 2 chickens dead, frozen solid in the night. The rest of the animals had survived, but barely. Maylene checked each one with hands that shook from more than just cold, and when she was satisfied they'd all make it, she turned to Caleb. You still want to stay? He looked at her standing in the snow, her face red from the cold, her eyes challenging him to admit he'd had enough. And he realized that despite everything, the cold, the isolation, the constant battle just to survive, he didn't want to be anywhere else. I'm not going anywhere. Something in her expression softened. Good, because I don't want you to. It was the most direct thing she'd said about her feelings since agreeing to let him court her, and it hit Caleb harder than he expected. He wanted to pull her close, to kiss her right there in the freezing barnyard, but he held back. They'd get there. When the time was right, they'd get there. January was marginally better than December, at least in terms of temperature. The days started getting longer too, adding minutes of daylight that felt like victories. Caleb marked each one, counting down the weeks until spring, even though he knew it was still months away. Mid-January brought Maylene's birthday. She didn't mention it, but Elias let it slip one morning at breakfast, and Caleb spent the next 3 days figuring out what to do about it. He had no money, no way to buy anything, and no materials to make something elaborate. But he had time and tools and a stubborn refusal to let the day pass unmarked. He carved her a chess set, working on it in secret whenever she was occupied elsewhere. The pieces were crude. He'd never been much for fine detail work, but they were functional and made from the same mountain pine that surrounded the valley. He finished it the night before her birthday and hid it in the barn. The next morning, he presented it to her after breakfast. She unwrapped the cloth he'd bundled it in and went very still, staring at the pieces. "You made this." "I did. It's not much, but it's perfect." She picked up one of the rooks, turning it over in her hands. "No one's ever made me anything before." "Really? Never?" "Never." She set the piece down carefully and looked at him with eyes that were suspiciously bright. "Thank you. You're welcome." That night she taught him to play chess by firelight, and Caleb discovered that she was devastatingly good at it. She beat him 5 games in a row without breaking a sweat. "You're terrible at this," she said, resetting the board for a 6th game. "I'm learning." "You're losing." "Same thing." She almost smiled. Not even close to the same thing. They played until Elias complained that the noise of moving pieces was keeping him awake, then packed up the set and sat together by the dying fire. "This was a good day," Maylene said quietly. "Yeah, it was." "I mean it. Most birthdays I just ignore. Easier that way. But this one," she trailed off. "This one I'll remember." Caleb wanted to tell her that there would be more birthdays, more good days, a whole lifetime of them if she'd let him give them to her. But he kept quiet and just sat beside her, letting the moment be what it was without pushing it to be something more. February brought a break in the weather, a week of clear skies and temperatures that climbed above freezing during the day. It was enough to get cabin fever at bay and remind them all that winter wouldn't last forever. Elias announced one morning that he wanted to check the upper pastures, see how much snow was still up there, and whether the fences had survived. It would be a long day's work, maybe 2 days, and he'd need help. "I'll go," Caleb said immediately. "Both of you will," Elias corrected. "I'm not as young as I used to be, and I'd rather not break something and have to crawl home. We'll leave at first light tomorrow, camp overnight, come back the day after." They packed supplies that evening: food, bedrolls, rope, tools for emergency repairs. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was another test, one last examination before Elias would fully accept him as permanent rather than temporary. They set out at dawn, moving slowly through snow that was still waist-deep in places. The going was brutal, each step requiring effort, but they made steady progress. By midday, they'd reached the upper pasture and found the fences mostly intact, just one section knocked down by what looked like an avalanche. "Could have been worse," Elias said, surveying the damage. "We'll fix it now, save ourselves work in spring." They spent the afternoon repairing the fence while the sun tracked across a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Caleb worked until his arms screamed and his back refused to straighten, but he didn't complain. Neither did Maylene, who matched him post for post, and Elias, who at 60 could still outwork most men half his age. By the time they finished, the sun was sinking and the temperature was dropping fast. They made camp in a sheltered spot against a rock face, built a fire, and huddled around it eating dried meat and hard bread. "You did good today," Elias said to Caleb. "Both of you did." "Thank you, sir." Elias was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Then he spoke again, his voice careful. "I'm going to tell you something I haven't told many people. When I bought this land, I thought I was just buying a place to disappear. Somewhere no one could find me, somewhere I could forget everything I'd left behind. The war, the people I'd lost, all of it." He paused, and Maylene glanced at Caleb, signaling him to stay quiet and listen. "I brought Maylene up here thinking it would be good for both of us. Clean start, fresh air, honest work. And it was all those things. But it was also the hardest thing I'd ever done. There were nights I thought we'd made a terrible mistake, that we'd both freeze or starve and no one would ever know what happened to us." Elias looked up from the fire. "But we didn't freeze and we didn't starve. We survived. And then we did more than survive. We built something that mattered." He turned to Caleb directly. "You came here running from grief, same as I did. And you could have kept running, should have kept running by any reasonable measure, but you stayed. You worked. You proved that you're not just passing through. He paused. So I'm going to ask you straight, what are your intentions with my daughter? Caleb felt Maylene tense beside him, but he kept his eyes on Elias. I want to marry her, if she'll have me. Have you asked her? Not yet. I wanted to get through winter first, like she asked. Elias nodded. Smart. Winter's not quite over, but it's close enough. He looked at his daughter. Maylene, what do you say to that? Maylene was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. Then she spoke, her voice steady and sure. I say yes, but not yet. She looked at Caleb. Ask me when spring comes. When the pass opens and you have the choice to leave, but you choose to stay anyway. Ask me then, and I'll give you my answer. It wasn't the answer Caleb had hoped for, but it was honest, and he understood what she needed. One last proof that he wasn't staying out of obligation or because he'd painted himself into a corner, but because he genuinely wanted to be here. I'll ask you then, he said. Elias smiled, actually smiled, and raised his canteen. To spring then, and to whatever comes after. They drank to that and settled in for the night. 3 people who'd learned that family wasn't always blood, that home wasn't always where you started, and that sometimes the hardest journeys led to the places you were meant to be all along. The trip back the next day was easier, the sun warm enough to make the snow pack down, and they reached the farm by mid-afternoon. Caleb immediately noticed something was wrong. The barn door was open and the chickens were scattered across the yard. Something got in, Maylene said, breaking into a run. They found the damage quickly. A mountain lion had forced its way into the barn overnight, killed 3 chickens, and injured a calf before something spooked it, and it ran. The surviving animals were terrified. The barn was a mess of blood and feathers, and they spent the rest of the day cleaning up and tending wounds. Could have been worse, Elias said that evening, exhausted. Could have lost everything. But Caleb saw the way Maylene's hands shook as she cleaned the blood from her coat, saw the fear in her eyes that she tried to hide. That night he found her sitting outside despite the cold, staring at the barn. You all right? She shook her head. I knew we shouldn't have all left. Should have had someone stay here to watch the place. We needed all 3 of us for the fence work. I know, but that doesn't change what happened. She turned to look at him. This is what I was talking about. One bad decision, one piece of bad luck, and everything falls apart. We can't afford mistakes. We didn't make a mistake. We made the best choice we could with the information we had. And it still almost cost us everything. Caleb sat down beside her. But it didn't. We lost 3 chickens, and that's terrible, but we didn't lose the whole flock. The calf will heal. We'll rebuild. That's what you do, right? You take the hit, and you keep going. Maylene was quiet for a long time, then leaned against him, just slightly, just enough. I hate that you're right. Get used to it. She elbowed him, but didn't pull away. March came with warmer days and the first signs that winter was actually, finally, ending. The snow started to melt in earnest, turning the valley into a muddy mess, but also revealing the land underneath. Green shoots appeared where the snow had cleared. The creek swelled with runoff. The air smelled different, fresh and alive in a way it hadn't in months. And one morning in mid-March, Caleb woke to the sound of geese flying overhead, their calls echoing through the valley like trumpets announcing spring. He found Maylene already outside, watching them pass. They're early this year, she said when he joined her. That a good sign? Usually. She kept watching the geese until they disappeared over the southern ridge. Pass should open soon. Maybe 2 weeks? Maybe less. 2 weeks. 2 weeks until he could ask her properly, until he could finally move forward with the life he wanted to build. They spent those weeks preparing for spring planting, clearing the fields of debris, checking equipment, making plans. Elias drew up the official terms of employment he'd promised months ago: fair wages, room and board, and a percentage of the profits from selling cattle and crops. It was more than generous. It was a partnership. You've earned this, Elias said when Caleb signed the papers. And if things go the way I think they will, we'll be redrawing these soon enough to make it a true partnership. The pass opened on March 28th, 3 days earlier than expected. They heard it from a rider who'd come up from town with mail and news. The road was clear, travel was possible, spring had officially arrived. That evening, Caleb asked Maylene to walk with him one more time to the overlook. The valley was transformed from the last time they'd stood here together, green and brown instead of white. The creek roaring with snowmelt, everything bursting with the kind of life that made winter feel like a distant dream. "We made it," Maylene said, looking out over the land. "We did. And you're still here." "I am." Caleb turned to face her, and the words he'd been carrying for months finally came out steady and sure. "Maylene Hart, I came to this valley with nothing but a lame horse and a head full of ghosts. You gave me a chance when you had no reason to. You taught me how to work this land, and you showed me what it means to build something that lasts. I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you never compromise on things that matter. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I can be the partner you deserve." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring he'd made from a piece of silver he'd found in Elias's workshop, hammered smooth and simple. "Will you marry me?" Maylene looked at the ring, then at him, and for a terrifying moment he thought she might say no. Then she smiled, really smiled, bright and unguarded in a way he'd never seen before. "Yes." Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger and she pulled him close, kissing him like she'd wanted to for months but hadn't let herself. And he understood that this was what real looked like, messy and earned and worth every hard day it had taken to get here. They were married in early May, just a simple ceremony with Elias officiating and the valley as witness. No guests, no fancy dress, just the three of them, and vows spoken under a sky so blue it looked painted. That night they started their life together in earnest. Two people who'd learned that love wasn't about perfect moments or grand gestures, but about choosing each other day after day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The first year of marriage taught Caleb that loving someone and living with them were two entirely different skills, and he was better at one than the other. Maylene had warned him she wasn't easy to live with, but he hadn't fully understood what that meant until they were sharing the same space every day with nowhere to escape when tensions ran high. She had her routines and expected them to be followed. She had opinions about everything from how to stack firewood to which fields should be planted first, and she didn't soften those opinions just because they were married now. When they disagreed, she didn't back down to keep the peace, and the arguments that followed were volcanic and exhausting. Their first real fight happened 3 weeks after the wedding, over something as stupid as how to repair a wagon wheel. Caleb thought they should replace the whole thing. Maylene insisted they could repair the existing one and save the cost. They argued about it in the barn while Elias pretended not to hear from across the yard. "You're being stubborn just to be stubborn," Caleb said, his patience fraying. "And you're being wasteful because you don't understand how tight our margins are," Maylene shot back. "We can't just throw away perfectly good equipment because fixing it takes more effort. It's not perfectly good. It's broken. Everything's broken at some point. That doesn't mean you give up on it." They glared at each other across the damaged wheel, both too proud to back down. Finally, Caleb threw up his hands. "Fine. We'll fix it your way. But when it breaks again in 2 months, don't say I didn't warn you. It won't break in 2 months because I know what I'm doing." She was right, of course. The wheel held for 2 years before needing replacement. But Caleb wasn't about to admit that in the moment. They fought about money, about work distribution, about whether to expand the herd or focus on crops. They fought about his habit of leaving tools scattered around and her tendency to rearrange things without telling him where they'd gone. They fought because they were both strong-willed and used to making decisions independently, and merging 2 lives into one partnership was messier and harder than either of them had expected. But they also learned. Slowly, painfully, they figured out how to fight without destroying what they'd built. They learned that going to bed angry just meant waking up still angry, so they stayed up late hashing things out even when they were exhausted. They learned that apologizing didn't mean losing. It meant caring more about the relationship than being right. They learned to pick their battles and let the small things go, because some hills weren't worth dying on. And underneath all the friction, there was love. The kind of love that showed up in small moments. Maylene bringing him coffee while he worked in the cold, Caleb taking on her least favorite chores without being asked, both of them learning to read each other's moods and give space when it was needed and closeness when it wasn't. 6 months into the marriage, Maylene told him she was pregnant. She said it matter-of-factly over breakfast one morning, the same way she might announce they needed more flour. Caleb nearly choked on his coffee. You're sure? I'm sure. How long have you known? 2 weeks, maybe 3. She kept eating, not meeting his eyes. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. Caleb set down his cup, trying to process. A baby. They were going to have a baby. The thought filled him with equal parts terror and joy. Are you happy about it? He asked. Maylene finally looked at him, and her expression was complicated. I'm scared. This valley isn't easy for adults, let alone a child, and I watched my mother die when I was 12. I know how quickly things can go wrong. Nothing's going to go wrong. You can't promise that. He couldn't. They both knew it. Child mortality was high even in cities with doctors and hospitals. Up here, isolated and hours from any medical help, the risks multiplied. Elias, who'd been listening from his corner of the table, spoke up. Fear's natural. Your mother was terrified when she found out she was carrying you. But fear doesn't mean you can't do it, just means you take it seriously. Maylene nodded but didn't look comforted. That night, lying in their small room, she admitted what she was really afraid of. What if I'm not good at it, being a mother? Caleb pulled her closer. You'll be good at it. You don't know that. I'm not soft or gentle or any of the things mothers are supposed to be. I'm hard and practical, and I don't know how to be anything else. Our kid won't need soft and gentle. They'll need strong and honest. They'll need someone who teaches them how to survive and work and not give up when things get hard. That's you. She was quiet for a long time, then whispered, I hope you're right. The pregnancy was difficult. Maylene worked through most of it because there was no choice. The farm didn't stop needing attention just because she was growing a human. But the work got harder as she got bigger, and Caleb watched her push through exhaustion and pain with the same stubborn determination she brought to everything. He tried to take on more of her tasks, but she resisted, insisting she wasn't fragile. I'm pregnant, not dying, she said when he tried to stop her from hauling water. I know that, but you don't have to do everything yourself anymore. Yes, I do. Because when you're gone or busy or hurt, I need to know I can still manage. I can't afford to get soft now. It drove him crazy, her refusal to accept help, but he understood it too. She'd spent her whole life proving she could handle anything thrown at her. Admitting weakness, even temporary weakness from pregnancy, felt like losing ground she'd fought too hard to gain. The baby came in early March, during a late-season storm that trapped them in the house for 3 days. There was no doctor, no midwife, just Elias and Caleb doing their best, while Maylene labored for 18 hours that felt like 18 years. Caleb had faced hard things before: grief, loss, brutal winters, near-death experiences, but nothing prepared him for the helplessness of watching someone he loved suffer and being unable to do anything about it. He held her hand and brought water and tried not to let his terror show, while Elias stayed calm and talked her through it with the steady voice of someone who'd been through this before. When the baby finally came, a girl with a furious cry and her mother's green eyes, Caleb wept with relief so overwhelming it nearly knocked him over. Maylene held their daughter and looked at Caleb with exhaustion and wonder. We need to name her. They'd discussed names for months without agreeing on anything. Now, looking at this tiny person who'd fought her way into the world during a blizzard, one name felt right. Jade, Caleb said, for her eyes. And because Jade is supposed to be strong. Maylene smiled. Jade, I like that. Jade Ryder proved to be exactly as stubborn as her mother and twice as loud. She cried at all hours, refused to sleep for more than 2 hours at a stretch, and seemed personally offended by anything that wasn't exactly to her liking. Caleb and Maylene stumbled through those first months in a fog of exhaustion, taking turns walking the baby at night, learning through trial and error what worked and what didn't. Elias was surprisingly helpful, stepping in when they were too tired to function, rocking Jade to sleep with a patience Caleb hadn't known the old man possessed. You did this with Maylene? Caleb asked one night, watching Elias hold the baby. Did it alone after her mother died. Hardest thing I ever went through. Elias looked down at Jade, his expression soft, but worth it. Always worth it. As Jade grew, the farm evolved with her. They baby-proofed the house as best they could, built a crib from mountain pine, arranged their work schedules so someone was always watching her. Maylene went back to her tasks gradually, rebuilding her strength, and Caleb learned to work one-handed while holding a baby in the other arm. Life became harder in some ways. Less sleep, more worry, constant vigilance to keep a curious toddler from hurting herself. But it also became richer. Watching Jade take her first steps across the kitchen floor, hearing her first words, seeing her face light up when she spotted the horses, these moments made everything else worthwhile. The farm itself grew too. With Caleb's labor and ideas combined with Elias's experience and Maylene's management, they expanded gradually. More fields under cultivation, a larger herd, better equipment. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable, more prosperous than they'd been before Caleb arrived. Town accepted him slowly. On the twice-yearly supply runs, Caleb went along and faced the stares and whispers that came with being the white man married to the Chinese woman. Some people were openly hostile, and others just curious. A few were kind. "You know what people say about you two?" a shopkeeper asked one day while Caleb was loading supplies. "I can imagine. They say it won't last. That you'll leave her eventually, same as the other one did." Caleb met the man's eyes. "Then they don't know me very well." "Maybe not, but talk is talk." The shopkeeper handed him change. "For what it's worth, I hope they're wrong. She seems like good people." "She's the best person I know." Caleb carried that conversation back to Maylene and told her what was said. She didn't seem surprised. "Let them talk. We know what we have, that's all that matters." But it did bother her. He could tell. The constant otherness, the way some people looked at their family like they were something wrong or unnatural. She handled it with her usual strength, but the weight of it showed in small ways. The tension in her shoulders when they were in town, the relief when they returned to the valley where no one could judge them. One evening, after a particularly difficult trip to town, where someone had made a comment about Jade being half-breed, Maylene sat on their porch looking more defeated than Caleb had ever seen her. "Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing bringing a child into this," she said quietly. Caleb sat beside her. "What do you mean?" "I mean she's going to face things because of who she is, because of who I am. People will treat her differently, make her feel like she doesn't fully belong anywhere, just like they did to me." Her voice cracked slightly. "I don't want that for her." "Then we teach her how to handle it, how to be strong like you, how to not let other people's ignorance define her. Is that enough?" "It has to be." Caleb took her hand. "Because the alternative is letting them win, letting them make us ashamed of what we've built, and I refuse to do that." Maylene squeezed his hand. "She's going to have to be tougher than other kids just to get by." "She will be. Look who her mother is." A small smile crossed Maylene's face. "And her father is pretty stubborn, too." "Damn right I am." They sat there as the sun set, two people who'd learned that love sometimes meant fighting battles you shouldn't have to fight, and that making a life together meant facing the world's ugliness head-on and refusing to back down. When Jade turned 3, Elias's health started declining. It happened gradually, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, tiredness that sleep didn't fix, weight loss that became alarming. He insisted it was nothing, just age catching up, but Maylene saw through it. "You need to see a doctor," she said. "Don't need a doctor to tell me I'm getting old. This isn't old. This is sick." They convinced him to make the trip to town in the spring. The doctor examined him and delivered news that landed like a stone. Consumption, advanced, probably had it for months. There wasn't much they could do except keep him comfortable. "How long?" Maylene asked, her voice steady but her face pale. "Hard to say. 6 months. Maybe a year if he's lucky." They brought Elias home and he took the news better than either of them expected. "We all die eventually," he said. "At least I got to see this place thrive. Got to see my daughter build a good life. Got to meet my granddaughter. That's more than a lot of men get." But knowing death was coming and watching it arrive were different things. Over the next months, Elias grew weaker. He couldn't work anymore, could barely make it from his bed to the table. Maylene cared for him with fierce devotion, and Caleb saw a side of her he'd never witnessed, tender and patient in ways she never was with anyone else. One evening, with Elias dozing by the fire and Jade playing on the floor, Maylene broke down for the first time since Caleb had known her. He found her outside the barn, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "He's dying," she said when Caleb pulled her close. "I know that. I've known it for months. But I'm not ready. I'm never going to be ready." "I know. He's all I had for so long, just him and me against everything. And now he's leaving, and I don't know how to do this without him." "You're not without him, and you're not alone. You have me. You have Jade. You have this whole valley you built together." Caleb held her tighter. "He's not leaving you with nothing. He's leaving you with everything." She cried harder then, all the grief she'd been holding back for months pouring out in waves. Caleb held her until she had nothing left, then walked her back inside where Elias was still sleeping and Jade was still playing, the world continuing despite everything. Elias died in early November, just as the first snow began to fall. He went peacefully in his sleep, which was a mercy. They buried him on the hillside overlooking the valley, in a spot he'd chosen months before. The grave was simple, a marker Caleb carved from pine with Elias's name and the years he'd lived in the single word Maylene insisted on, builder. "Because that's what he was," she said at the small service they held. "He built this farm from nothing. He built a life when everyone said he couldn't. He built a home for us when the world wouldn't give us one. And he built me into someone strong enough to keep going without him." She didn't cry at the funeral. The tears had already been spent. But Caleb saw how she carried the loss, how it weighed on her even as she refused to let it break her. The winter after Elias's death was the hardest they'd faced. Not because of the weather, it was actually milder than usual, but because his absence was everywhere. His empty chair at the table, his tools hanging unused, his steady presence that had anchored them both for so long, just gone. Maylene threw herself into work with even more intensity than before, as if motion could outrun grief. Caleb led her for a while, understanding the need, but eventually he had to pull her back. "You're going to burn yourself out," he said one night when she was still working at midnight. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're running yourself into the ground because you think staying busy means not feeling it. I know because I did the same thing after Sarah died." Maylene stopped working and looked at him. "And what did you learn?" "That grief doesn't care how busy you are. It'll wait as long as it takes, and when you finally stop moving, it'll still be there. Better to face it now than let it build up until it buries you." She set down her tools. "I don't know how to face it. Every time I think about him being gone, it feels like drowning." "Then drown with me holding on to you. You don't have to do this alone." She let him hold her then, and they stood in the barn with the horses breathing and the night pressing against the walls. Two people who'd both lost fathers and learned that grief was just love with nowhere to go. Over time, the sharp edges of loss dulled to something more manageable. Maylene found ways to honor Elias's memory, continuing his traditions, teaching Jade stories about her grandfather, maintaining the farm with the same standards he'd set. And slowly, the farm stopped feeling like Elias's legacy and started feeling like theirs, something they were building together, for themselves and for Jade and for whatever came next. 3 years after Elias's death, Maylene told Caleb she wanted another child. "You sure?" he asked. "I'm sure. Jade needs a sibling, and this farm needs people to carry it forward. One child isn't enough." The second pregnancy was easier than the first, maybe because they knew what to expect, or maybe because Maylene had accepted that letting Caleb help wasn't weakness. Their son arrived in summer, healthy and loud, with Caleb's dark hair and a stubborn streak that suggested he'd inherited the worst traits from both parents. They named him Elias, after the man who'd given them both a home. With 2 children, the farm became even more chaotic. Jade, now 7, took her role as big sister seriously, helping with the baby and bossing around anyone who'd listen. Young Elias proved to be curious about everything and afraid of nothing, a dangerous combination that required constant vigilance. Caleb and Maylene adapted, dividing responsibilities, covering for each other, learning that parenthood was less about perfection and more about survival, and making sure everyone made it to the next day relatively intact. The children changed how they saw the farm too. It wasn't just their livelihood anymore. It was their children's inheritance. Every field they planted, every building they maintained, every decision they made was about creating something that would outlast them. "We should expand the southern field," Caleb said one spring evening while they were planning the year's work. That's a lot of work for not much extra yield. Now, yeah, but in 10 years when the kids are old enough to help, we'll need the space. Maylene considered. You're thinking long term. I'm thinking about what we're leaving them. She smiled. Look at you. The drifter who showed up here planning to leave the next day, now planning a decade ahead. People change. They do. She kissed him. For the better, sometimes. As the years passed, the valley became known for the Hartrider Farm, one of the most successful operations in the region. People came from town occasionally to buy cattle or crops, or to see if the rumors about the mixed family living in the mountains were true. Some came with prejudice, others with curiosity, a few with respect. Caleb and Maylin handled it all with the same approach. Work hard, mind your business, and don't apologize for existing. They raised their children to be proud of who they were, to work for what they needed, and to never let anyone make them feel lesser. Jade grew into a young woman who was sharp as her mother and stubborn as both parents combined. She learned every aspect of running the farm and made it clear she had no interest in anything else. The valley was in her blood the same way it was in Maylene's. Young Elias was different, more curious about the world beyond the mountains, always asking about towns and cities and places he'd never seen. Caleb saw some of his younger self in the boy, that restlessness that said staying still wasn't enough. You think he'll leave? Maylene asked one night when Elias was 12. Maybe. Probably. Caleb looked at her. Would that be so bad? No. I want him to choose this life because he wants it, not because he feels trapped by it. Same as Jade. She paused. But I hope he comes back. He will. This place has a way of pulling people back. 23 years after Caleb first rode into the valley with a lame horse and no plan beyond the next town, he stood on the porch of the expanded farmhouse watching his children work in the fields below. Jade was teaching her younger brother how to properly irrigate the rows. Their laughter carried up the slope on the wind. Maylene came out and stood beside him, gray threading through her black hair now, lines around her eyes from years of squinting at the sun. She was 49 years old and more beautiful than the day he'd met her. What are you thinking about? She asked. About how I almost left a dozen times that first year. How close I came to saddling up my horse and disappearing before anyone woke up. What stopped you? You did. This place did. The idea that maybe I could be someone different than who I'd been. He turned to look at her. I was running from myself when I got here. Took me a long time to realize that. And now? Now I've been standing still so long I've put down roots. Can't run, even if I wanted to. He smiled, which I don't. Maylene took his hand. You know what my father told me before he died? He said you were the best thing that ever happened to this farm. Better than good weather or good luck or anything else. Because you showed up broken and let us help put you back together. And in exchange, you helped us become something bigger than we could have been alone. He said that? He did, and he was right. She squeezed his hand. We built something good here, Caleb. Something that'll outlast both of us. He looked out at the valley, at the fields they'd planted and harvested year after year, at the buildings they'd expanded and repaired, at the children who carried their legacy forward. He thought about Elias buried on the hillside and Sarah buried somewhere in Arizona and all the ghosts he'd carried with him that had finally, mercifully, gone quiet. Yes, he said. We did. That evening at dinner, the whole family gathered around the table that had been built from valley pine 2 decades ago. Jade talked about the new irrigation system she wanted to try. Young Elias announced he'd been accepted to a school in Denver and would be leaving in the fall. The news hit hard, but Caleb and Maylene had expected it, and they gave their blessing even as it hurt. You'll come back though, right? Jade asked her brother. Of course. This is home. Always will be. Elias looked at his parents. But I need to see what else is out there. Need to know I chose this instead of just accepting it because it was all I knew. Caleb understood that completely. Just don't stay gone too long. Your mother will worry. I'll worry, Maylene corrected. Your father will pretend he's not worried while actually worrying twice as much. They laughed, and the conversation moved on to other things. Plans for the fall harvest, repairs needed before winter, whether they should get another dog since the current one was getting old. Normal things, family things. The kind of conversations Caleb had never thought he'd have when he was 26 and broken and riding north with no destination. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Caleb and Maylene sat on the porch like they'd done 1,000 times before. The stars were out, bright and cold, and the valley was quiet except for the creek running and the wind moving through the trees. "You ever regret it?" Maylene asked. "Staying here? Giving up whatever else you might have had?" Caleb thought about the question seriously before answering. "No. I've had moments where things were hard and I wondered if I was crazy for choosing this life. But regret? Never. This was always where I was supposed to end up. Just took me a while to find it." "You found it because your horse went lame." "Yeah, luckiest piece of bad luck I ever had." Maylene laughed, the sound warm and real. "You know what I think? I think people spend so much time looking for big, meaningful moments that they miss the small ones that actually matter. The daily work, the quiet conversations, the way you know someone well enough to read their mood from across a field. That's where real life happens. Everything else is just noise." "When'd you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just weren't paying attention." He pulled her close and they sat together watching the stars wheel overhead. Two people who'd learned that home wasn't where you started, but where you chose to stay. That family wasn't always blood, but sometimes the people you built a life with. That running from pain didn't work, but running towards something better sometimes did. The valley had changed them both. Maylene had learned to let someone in, to trust that not everyone would leave, to believe that love could be something other than loss. Caleb had learned to stand still, to work without running, to plant seeds and wait for them to grow instead of always chasing the next horizon. Together they'd built something that mattered. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and solid in theirs. A farm that fed them, children who carried their strength forward. A partnership forged through hard work and harder winters, and the daily choice to keep choosing each other. Years later, when Caleb was old and gray and watching his grandchildren play in the same yard where Jade and Elias had played, he'd think back to that first night in the valley, the lame horse, the green-eyed woman who'd opened the barn door, the decision to stay just one more day that had somehow turned into a lifetime. He'd think about Sarah and Elias and all the people who'd shaped him into who he became. He'd think about the man he'd been, broken and lost and running from everything, and the man he'd turned into, steady and present and grateful for every ordinary day. But mostly he'd think about Maylene, still working at 73 because she didn't know how to be still stubborn and strong and absolutely herself. The woman who'd saved him by refusing to make it easy. Who'd demanded he earn his place and then helped him do it. Who'd turned a valley in the middle of nowhere into the center of everything that mattered. And he'd know, with the certainty that only comes from decades of proof, that every hard day and cold night and backbreaking hour of work had been worth it. Because in the end, he hadn't just found a place to stop running. He'd found a reason to stay. And that made all the difference. The farm would outlast them both, passed down to Jade, who loved it as fiercely as her mother, and maybe someday to her children, and on until the original story was forgotten, but the foundation remained, built by a grief-worn cowboy and a Chinese woman with green eyes who looked at a hard land and decided to make it home. That was the legacy. Not wealth or fame or anything the world would remember. Just a farm that endured, a family that thrived, and two people who chose each other every day for the rest of their lives. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.